Black River Falls, Wisconsin. Winter didn't arrive gently here. It came hard, fast, and without apology. By the late 1800s, every grown man in the settlement knew the routine. You cut wood until your hands split. You stacked it higher than you thought you'd need. And when January came, you burned it like your life depended on it, because it did. On one particular night, the temperature dropped so fast, the air seemed to crack. Wind pushed through chinks in log walls. Ice formed on the inside of windows. Families slept in shifts, feeding fires every few hours, just to keep the cold from settling into their bones. Men believed this was the price of survival. Cold was the enemy, fire was the weapon, and exhaustion was simply part of the deal. But not everyone fought winter the same way. While the rest of the town stayed awake, burning oak and pine, one man slept through the night. Not beside a roaring hearth, not buried under firs. He slept underground 6 feet below the cabin floor, inside a space his neighbors had spent all summer laughing at. They called it a grave, said he was wasting strength digging when any sensible man would be stacking logs and raising walls. That night, the outside temperature fell below 20 degrees under zero. Inside most cabins, the cold won anyway. Fires burned down. Breath turned visible. Fingers went numb. People woke up more tired than when they went to bed. But under the frozen ground, that man slept steady and warm. No fire to tend, no panic, no fighting the night. That wasn't luck. And it wasn't stubbornness, it was understanding. Frontier history is full of stories about strength and grit, but most winters weren't survived by brute force alone. They were survived by men who learned where not to spend their energy, men who stopped trying to overpower nature and instead learned how to step aside and let it work for them. That night didn't just expose how cold Wisconsin could get. It exposed something else. Most people were fighting the wrong battle. And one quiet immigrant had already figured that out. On the American frontier, winter didn't usually kill people in dramatic ways. There were no heroic last stands against blizzards, no frozen bodies found clutching rifles. Most deaths were quieter than that, slower, harder to notice until it was too late. Cold worked its damage over weeks, not hours. Men who survived the fall hunting season would weaken by February. Sleep became shallow and broken. Muscles never fully warmed. Fingers stayed stiff. Small illnesses turned serious. A cough lingered. A chest infection settled in. By the time spring arrived, some never stood back up. The problem wasn't exposure outside. It was what happened inside. Frontier cabins were never truly warm. Even with a strong fire, heat stayed near the hearth. 10 feet away, temperatures dropped fast. At night, when fires burned low, the cold crept in from every surface, walls, floors, ceilings. A man could be indoors and still lose body heat all night long. Sleep was the weak link. Cold sleep drains the body faster than hard labor. When a man sleeps cold, his heart works harder. His immune system slows down. His recovery never finishes. Do that for weeks and strength disappears no matter how much food he eats. That's why winter sickness spread so easily. It wasn't damp air alone. It wasn't bad luck. It was exhaustion layered on exhaustion. Most settlers thought the solution was more firewood, burn more, cut more, wake up more often to stoke the flames. But that solution came at a cost. Cutting wood in winter burns calories fast. It strains joints. It steals daylight hours needed for repairs, hunting, or rest. By January, many men were spending more energy staying warm than they gained from sleeping. Predators didn't take most lives, cold fatigue did. That's what made Lars Eriksson's choice different. He wasn't trying to make the cabin warmer, he was trying to protect his sleep. He understood, whether by experience or instinct, that survival depended on where your body recovered, not where you spent your waking hours. Winter doesn't defeat you in the storm. It defeats you at night quietly while you're trying to rest. Lars Eriksson was not the kind of man people expected to change anything. He didn't talk much. He didn't argue at the general store. He didn't explain himself when others doubted him. He was a Norwegian immigrant in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, already weathered by years of hard work. Like most men who came from cold places, he carried winter differently. He didn't complain about it. He watched it. Back in Norway, winters had taught him lessons Wisconsin settlers hadn't learned yet. Fuel was never endless. Stone and earth mattered more than flame. Old hunting camps in the mountains weren't built for comfort or pride. They were built for survival. You slept where the cold couldn't reach you easily. You didn't heat air if you could heat mass. And you never wasted strength fighting something you could step around. Lars didn't bring blueprints with him to America. He brought memory. When he arrived in Black River Falls, he built like everyone else at first. A modest log cabin, a solid roof, a corner fireplace. But he noticed the same thing every winter. No matter how much wood you burned, the cold always came back at night. Fires died. Walls chilled. Sleep suffered. That's when he stopped thinking about the cabin and started thinking about the ground beneath it. Earth doesn't behave like air. It doesn't panic when the temperature drops. It doesn't care about wind. 6 feet down the soil stays steady. Lars had known this his whole life. Root cellars proved it. Wells proved it. Snow-covered ground proved it. The question wasn't whether the earth stayed warmer. The question was why no one slept there. When Lars started digging, it wasn't rebellion, it was practicality. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was solving a problem that mattered to him personally: how to wake up rested in January. He didn't need approval, he needed results. And if the answer meant working with the ground instead of against the sky, then that's where he was willing to sleep. By early summer, word had spread through Black River Falls that Lars Eriksson was doing something wrong. Not dangerous, not illegal, just wrong in the way frontier men used the word when something offended common sense. Instead of stacking logs or raising walls, Lars spent his days digging, straight down, shoveling topsoil, then clay, then dense packed earth that hadn't seen daylight since the glaciers left. Men stopped on their way to the river to watch. Some shook their heads, others laughed. A few offered advice he didn't ask for. "You build up here," one man told him, "not down." Another said he was wasting the strongest months of the year on work that would only make winter worse. Digging meant dampness. Dampness meant sickness. Everyone knew that. Earth was cold. Air was warm. That was settled knowledge. The most vocal critic was an experienced carpenter, a man who had built cabins across 3 states. He said Lars was throwing away labor no homesteader could afford. 2 months of digging could have been 2 cords of stacked oak. 2 months of digging didn't keep snow off your head. Lars listened. He nodded. Then he kept digging. What bothered people wasn't just the hole. It was that Lars didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He didn't try to convince anyone. On the frontier, silence was often taken as ignorance. Men who knew what they were doing usually said so. But Lars worked the way mountain men worked, head down, steady pace, no wasted motion. By July, the pit was deep enough to make people uneasy. 6 feet down, lined with stone, wide enough for 2 sleepers. It didn't look like progress. It looked like retreat, like something poor people did when they had no better options. That was the real offense. The frontier was supposed to be about rising above hardship. Big fires, big cabins, visible effort. Lars was disappearing into the ground, and it felt backward. What no one wanted to admit was this: they were judging the work by how it looked, not by what it did. And winter doesn't care how your ideas look. What Lars Eriksson was doing wasn't new. It just looked new to people who had forgotten where it came from. Across Europe, long before coal stoves and framed houses, people built with the ground, not against it. In Norway, sod houses were common. Thick earth walls, roofs covered in grass, homes half sunk into hillsides. They weren't poor shelters. They were practical ones. They stayed warm in winter and cool in summer with very little fuel. The same idea existed everywhere. Cold lived longer than comfort. Root cellars across the Midwest kept food from freezing without heat. Spring houses kept milk cold in July. Wells never iced over, no matter how brutal the air became. People depended on these spaces every day, but they didn't sleep in them. Somewhere between knowing and applying, the lesson stopped short. America, especially on the frontier, valued visible progress. Tall walls, clear windows, fireplaces you could stand beside and feel. Sleeping underground felt like going backward. It reminded people of poverty, of old countries they had left behind, of ways of living they thought they had outgrown. So the knowledge stayed fragmented. Settlers trusted the earth to protect potatoes, water, and meat, but not their own bodies. They accepted that the ground held steady temperature, but they never asked why that same stability couldn't be used where it mattered most. Rest. Lars did. He didn't see the ground as dirty or primitive. He saw it as reliable. Fire was unpredictable. Wind changed it. Wood ran out. Earth stayed put. Earth didn't care about storms. That difference mattered. Most men were burning forests to heat air that escaped by morning. Lars was building a place where heat didn't need to be chased. It stayed. This wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't tradition for tradition's sake. It was selective memory, taking what worked and discarding what didn't. The old world had learned this lesson slowly over centuries of cold winters and limited fuel. The new world had access to more wood, more land, and more optimism, and forgot it just as quickly. Lars wasn't rejecting progress. He was reconnecting it to something solid. What Lars understood wasn't mysterious, it just wasn't popular. Most frontier builders focused on air. Warm air rising, cold air sinking, drafts, chimneys, fireplaces. Everything was about managing air temperature. The problem was simple air changes, fast. Wind strips heat away. Cold nights erase whatever warmth you made during the day. The ground doesn't work that way. Below a certain depth, soil temperature stops following the weather. It follows the average temperature of the region instead. In northern Wisconsin, that meant somewhere around the mid-40s to low 50s. Fahrenheit year-round. Summer heat barely reached it. Winter cold never touched it. That depth mattered. Above the frost line, the ground freezes and thaws. Below it, temperature stays steady. Lars dug past that line on purpose. 6 feet wasn't random. It was where the earth stopped reacting and started stabilizing. Stone mattered too. Loose soil shifts temperature faster than dense mass. Stone absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. That makes it predictable. When Lars lined his chamber with river rock and sealed it with clay mortar, he wasn't just building walls. He was creating thermal mass, something that could hold warmth instead of letting it leak away. Insulation completed the system. Most cabins lost heat through roofs and floors as much as through walls. Lars packed sawdust above the chamber ceiling because trapped air slows heat movement. He wasn't trying to make the space hot. He was trying to stop it from changing. That's the key difference. Comfort doesn't require high temperature. It requires stability. A body can rest in 54 degrees if nothing is pulling heat away from it. Cold walls steal warmth. Stable walls don't. This wasn't theory. It was observable everywhere. Root cellars proved it. Wells proved it. Snow-covered ground proved it. Lars simply applied it to where his body spent 8 hours every night. The physics were straightforward. The conclusion was uncomfortable. Most men weren't freezing because winter was unbeatable. They were freezing because they were heating the wrong thing. What Lars built wasn't a sleeping pit. It wasn't a bunker, and it certainly wasn't a grave, no matter what his neighbors called it. It was a system. The chamber was dug 8 feet long and 6 feet wide. Enough space to sleep without feeling trapped, but small enough to control temperature. Lars didn't leave bare earth exposed. Bare dirt sweats, it crumbles, it shifts. He lined every wall with rounded river stones hauled by hand, each one chosen for size and fit. Stone does two things dirt can't. It stays dry and it holds heat. He mortared the stones with a simple mix of clay sand and lime. Not to make it pretty, but to seal air gaps. Drafts are the enemy of thermal stability. A single crack can turn a warm space into a cold one. The ceiling mattered most. Across the top of the chamber, Lars laid heavy, hand-hewn timbers. On top of those, he packed a thick layer of dry sawdust before replacing the cabin floor. Sawdust was cheap, easy to find, and full of trapped air. That air slowed heat loss upward into the colder cabin. The trapdoor wasn't an afterthought. It was tight-fitting, insulated, and positioned away from direct drafts. When closed, it separated two climates, the unstable air above and the steady earth below. Ventilation was simple, but deliberate. A narrow air channel allowed slow circulation without flushing heat. Too much airflow would defeat the purpose. Too little would cause dampness. Lars balanced it by instinct and experience. Nothing about the chamber relied on fire. Once built, it didn't need attention. No tending, no feeding, no midnight labor. It worked because it stayed the same while everything else changed. That's why calling it a bed missed the point. Lars didn't move his mattress underground. He moved his sleep into a different environment. And in winter, environment decides everything. Duavautali. The real test didn't come slowly, it came all at once. In mid-January, winter dropped its full weight on Black River Falls. The temperature fell through zero by midday and kept going. By sunset, men were already worried. By midnight, they were exhausted. Fires burned hot, then burned down. Axes rang in the dark as men split emergency wood by lantern light. By 3 a.m, the mercury reached 23 degrees below zero. Inside most cabins, the air felt sharp and dry. Frost crept across window frames. Breath hung in clouds. Even near the hearth, warmth didn't last. Men slept in bursts, 30 minutes here, an hour there, waking to feed the fire before the cold could settle into their joints. That was survival as everyone understood it. Above ground in Lars Eriksson's cabin, it wasn't much different. His fire burned down to coals. The room cooled fast. By early morning, ice crystals formed along the logs near the door. If he'd slept there, he would have felt it like everyone else. But Lars wasn't there. He climbed down the ladder, closed the insulated trapdoor, and stepped into a different world. The stone walls felt cool, but not cold. The air didn't move. There was no draft, no bite, no urgency. The temperature stayed steady, hovering in the low 50s. He lay down with a single wool blanket and slept through the night. No fire to tend, no alarms from cracking logs, no calculation about how much wood was left. While others fought the cold hour by hour, Lars let the earth do what it always does, hold steady. By morning, the difference was impossible to ignore. Men stumbled out of their cabins stiff and hollow-eyed. Hands shook as they rebuilt fires. They counted the wood they'd burned and did the math in their heads, wondering how many nights like this they could survive. Then Lars emerged. He looked rested. Not triumphant, not smug, just normal. Warm enough to move without hesitation. That night didn't prove he was clever. It proved everyone else had been exhausting themselves unnecessarily. Most people think warmth comes from air temperature. That's only half the truth. What your body actually responds to is the temperature of the surfaces around you. Walls, floors, ceilings. When those surfaces are cold, they pull heat out of your body no matter how warm the air feels for a moment. That's why frontier cabins were so miserable at night. A cabin might read 34 degrees near the bed, but the walls were colder. The floor was colder. The ceiling was colder. Every surface absorbed body heat. A man lying still lost warmth faster than he could replace it. Blankets helped, but only up to a point. The environment kept draining him. Fire couldn't fix that. A roaring hearth warmed the air briefly, but it couldn't warm the entire structure. Once the flames died down, the cold surfaces reclaimed everything. Lars's chamber worked differently. The stone walls stayed near the same temperature all night. They didn't pull heat from his body. They radiated it back. The earth behind those stones acted like a massive thermal buffer, preventing sudden drops. Nothing spiked. Nothing crashed. 54 degrees in that space felt warmer than 34 degrees by a fire because the temperature was even. No cold drafts. No icy walls. No heat being stolen from skin and lungs. Modern engineers call this mean radiant temperature. Frontier settlers just called it comfort when they were lucky enough to experience it. Lars didn't need his chamber to be hot. He needed it to stop stealing heat. Once that happened, his own body did the rest. Human bodies give off warmth constantly. In a stable space, that warmth accumulates instead of disappearing. That's why he slept under one blanket while others layered fur on fur. He wasn't out heating winter. He was removing winter from the equation altogether. Firefights cold for a moment. Stable environments outlast it. That's the difference most people never learned, and the reason Lars slept better than men, burning 3 times the wood. Frontier men didn't apologize when they were wrong. They changed their behavior. The morning after that brutal night, neighbors gathered near Lars Eriksson's cabin. They didn't come to argue. They came to look. Smoke rose from his chimney like everyone else's. His fire had burned down. Nothing about the cabin suggested special treatment. But Lars himself did. He moved easily. No stiffness, no red nose, no rush to rebuild the fire. He looked like a man who had slept. That alone unsettled people. Someone finally asked the question that mattered. How cold was it down there? Lars didn't exaggerate. He didn't brag. He gave a number, low 50s, steady all night, 1 blanket, no fire. That changed the tone. Men who had burned half a cord of wood in one night listened differently when the math stopped favoring them. Experience mattered on the frontier, but results mattered more. And Lars had results. Within days, curiosity replaced mockery. One by one, men asked to see the chamber. They climbed down the ladder expecting dampness drafts or discomfort. What they found was stillness, dry air, no bite, no urgency to leave. The carpenter who had laughed the loudest spent a full night underground. He came up quiet, not embarrassed, thoughtful. He didn't talk about pride or tradition. He talked about wood savings, about sleep, about how tired he'd been for years without realizing it. Doctors noticed the change too. Lars wasn't coughing. He wasn't run down. He wasn't fighting the same winter sickness everyone else accepted as normal. That mattered. On the frontier, belief followed proof. Once men saw that the chamber didn't weaken, Lars didn't sicken him, and didn't fail when winter was at its worst, resistance collapsed fast. Not because the idea was clever, because it worked. And when survival is on the line, working beats tradition every time. Once the doubt broke, the idea spread fast. Winter doesn't leave much room for theory. Men watched their woodpiles shrink. They felt the difference in their bodies. And they did the math. When one solution clearly worked, pride stepped aside. By late winter, Lars wasn't alone anymore. Families asked questions first. How deep? How wide? How much stone could it be added to an existing cabin, or did it require starting over? Lars answered plainly. He didn't sell the idea as comfort. He sold it as efficiency. Less wood, better sleep, fewer sick days. That language landed. Not everyone built it the same way. Some dug deep and lined their chambers carefully. Those worked best. Others cut corners. They stopped short of the frost line or skipped proper insulation above the ceiling. Their chambers stayed warmer than the cabin but didn't reach the same stability. A few failed outright because they ignored ventilation and created damp spaces. Those mistakes mattered. The idea wasn't magic. It followed rules. Depth mattered, stone mattered, ceiling mattered, ventilation mattered. When those rules were followed, results were consistent. When they weren't, people learned quickly why. What surprised many was how adaptable the concept proved to be. Older men built smaller chambers. Families with little money used fieldstone instead of hauled rock. Some dug directly beneath existing floors in stages, keeping their cabins intact while expanding downward. None of these people were chasing comfort for its own sake. They were chasing margin. Margin meant fewer cords of wood cut in dangerous weather. Margin meant energy left over for hunting, repairs, and family. Margin meant waking up with strength instead of dread. By the next winter, underground sleeping chambers were no longer a curiosity. They were a quiet trend. No announcements, no arguments. Just men digging when the ground was soft and sleeping better when it wasn't. That's how real frontier innovation moved. Not with speeches, with shovels, numbers, and better mornings. Most people assumed the underground chamber was about firewood. It wasn't. Wood savings were obvious, but they were secondary. The real advantage showed up in the body. Men who slept warm recovered. Men who slept cold didn't. Over weeks, that difference decided who stayed capable and who slowly fell apart. Cold sleep steals strength quietly. It raises heart rate all night. It prevents deep rest. It keeps muscles tense. A man can eat well and still lose ground if his sleep never finishes the job of repair. Frontier winters punished that mistake relentlessly. Lars understood something many didn't articulate. At the time, energy is finite. Every hour spent cutting extra wood is an hour not spent healing, fixing tools, or paying attention to family. Burning more fuel feels productive, but it often hides inefficiency. His chamber shifted the equation. Instead of using fire to fight winter 8 hours a night, he used structure to remove winter from his sleep entirely. That meant he woke up with energy instead of debt. Over a season, that advantage compounded. Health followed. Men noticed Lars wasn't getting sick the way others did. He wasn't worn thin by February. His children benefited too. Even sleeping above ground, they lived in a household where their father wasn't exhausted, irritable, or constantly racing the fire. Doctors eventually noticed the pattern. Chronic cold exposure weakened people. Warm, stable sleep strengthened them. The chamber didn't just save labor, it preserved resilience. That's why the idea stuck. On the frontier, survival wasn't about being tough once. It was about staying capable every day. Lars's solution protected the one place where capability is rebuilt: sleep. This wasn't comfort seeking, it was risk reduction. Winter doesn't kill everyone at once. It wears people down until something small finishes the job. Lars removed that wear from the equation, and that changed everything. What Lars figured out in the 1890s still makes people uncomfortable today. Modern homes rely on active systems, furnaces, heat pumps, electric heaters. When they work, they feel effortless. When they fail, everything collapses fast. Power goes out, fuel runs short, or a system breaks in the middle of winter, and suddenly comfort depends on how fast help arrives. That's not resilience, that's dependence. Most modern houses are designed to look warm, not to stay warm without energy. Thin walls, large windows, empty air spaces. They lose heat constantly and compensate by burning more fuel. The system works as long as the inputs keep coming. Lars built the opposite. His sleeping space didn't need energy to maintain comfort. It needed correct placement mass and insulation. Once those were in place, the system ran on physics alone. No moving parts, no supply chains, no emergency repairs at 3 in the morning. That difference matters more now than ever. Off-grid builders are rediscovering this idea for a reason. Energy costs rise, power becomes less reliable, weather grows less predictable. When those pressures increase, passive systems outperform active ones. They don't need to be managed. They don't fail suddenly. They degrade slowly, if at all. Modern construction often ignores the ground entirely. Basements are treated as storage or mechanical spaces, not as thermal assets. Builders spend money fighting soil moisture and heat transfer instead of using them intentionally. That's a choice, not a necessity. Lars didn't reject technology. He used the best materials available to him, stone, lime, wood, and applied them where they mattered most. His system didn't compete with fire. It reduced the need for it. That's the lesson modern homes still struggle with. True efficiency doesn't come from better machines alone. It comes from designing spaces that don't need to be rescued by machines in the first place. By the time spring loosened winter's grip, the lesson was clear to anyone willing to see it. The warmest place in January wasn't beside the biggest fire. It wasn't the cabin with the thickest logs or the most expensive stove. It was the place that didn't change when everything else did. The place that stayed steady while wind howled and temperatures crashed. That place was underground. Lars Ericsson never claimed to invent anything. He didn't give it a name. He didn't write a manual. When asked why it worked, he gave simple answers. The ground stays warm. Stone holds heat. Insulation keeps it from escaping. Sleep where the cold can't reach you. That simplicity is what made people uneasy. Frontier culture respected hard work, visible effort, and fire you could feel on your face. Lars chose quiet reliability instead. No spectacle, no heroics, just a system that reduced risk instead of fighting it. That's the deeper lesson his neighbors learned, even if they never said it out loud. Real survival isn't loud. It doesn't look impressive. It doesn't announce itself. It removes problems before they demand strength. It protects recovery. It preserves energy. It lets people wake up ready instead of already behind. Over time, the technique faded. Cheap fuel arrived. Electricity followed. Central heating made winter feel conquered. People forgot why earlier generations had worked so hard to stay warm without burning themselves out. But the physics never changed. The earth still holds steady heat. Stone still stores it. Stable environments still protect the human body better than brute force ever will. When energy becomes expensive again or unreliable, these ideas return because they always work. Lars didn't defeat winter. He stepped out of its reach. That's what frontier wisdom really looks like. Not toughness for its own sake, not suffering as proof of strength, but understanding where to place your effort so nature carries the load instead of crushing you under it. The fire burns bright, the earth holds steady, and in the hardest winters, steady wins.